وذكر فإن الذكرى تنفع المؤمنين.
والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وآله وصحبه ومن والاه. You may recall that in my second lecture I attempted to trace the always tense, often quite dismal story of the mutual comprehension or lack of it between the three great Abrahamic religions. I pointed out in particular the considerable overlap that exists in prophetic history and the disparities that exist, particularly concerning the last two of the great Abrahamic prophets, namely Jesus and Muhammad. What I hope to do today is to trace other aspects of this long-standing historical interaction, not so much the religious side of things, but other dimensions. The question of the transmission of science, technology, medicine, and philosophical ideas from the Islamic world to the world of the West. And as I go in my usual style, I'll follow various red herrings, which hopefully will elucidate some of the blank spots that have appeared in the various presentations so far. Also, as I promised on Monday, I hope to leave an unusually long space at the end for questions. So any questions you might have on today's lecture or indeed on Monday's, I'll be very happy to at least try and answer them for you. So, the impact of Islam on medieval Europe. This is a complicated story. It's also a hugely important story. One could even call it the most important episode of cultural transmission in the world's intellectual history. I think one could make a large claim like that for it. The first, and historically also the most effective vehicle of such an osmosis, was in fact the comparatively undistinguished, in some minds, vehicle of trade. We sometimes forget that Islam in the Middle Ages was a great commercial civilization, not just a great religious civilization whose preoccupations were very much focused on God, but also a very successful material culture as well. Islam, of course, found this quite easy to achieve because it had its roots in a trading community. The Blessed Prophet was himself from Mecca, which was a great entrepot city, which sent caravans of traders across the desert, rather in the way that, say, a city like Venice 1,000 years later would be sending great argosies of galleons across the oceans. It was an entrepot city, very much as Venice was later to be. And we know that the Blessed Prophet himself had joined at least one caravan to Syria. And his precedent as an honest merchant in subsequent generations of Islam lent enormous prestige to the vocation of the trader, the businessman, the merchant. Medieval Islam was not one of those civilizations which tended to regard the mercantile profession as a rather base and worldly vocation. It was regarded always with considerable esteem. The second great dimension of this was, of course, the conquests themselves, which within a century of the Prophet's death had created this quite unprecedented unitive state which stretched from Provence in southern France in the extreme west all the way through to the borders of China in the east. And one consequence of this was that the great ancient iron curtain of the old world, namely that which had separated the Mediterranean cultures to the west from the eastern cultures, the Indian and the Persian to the east, was suddenly no more. This great cultural divide had existed for at least 1,000 years. Alexander the Great had done the most to try and overcome it, but of course, as we know, his empire did not long outlive him. So this great new political fact, which completely overturned all of the old certainties and all of the old intellectual and also, of course, economic patterns, was the basis for the foundation of this great mercantile civilization, founded in the Middle East, which since time immemorial had been, by virtue of its geographic position, the great nexus of trade. So, two factors. First of all, the legitimacy of a mercantile piety in the Islamic ethos. Secondly, the sheer geographical fact of Islam's centrality in the world. And this domination of the world economy by the cultures of Islam continued well into the 17th century. The obvious reason for its final unravelling was the European discoveries of routes around the Cape of Good Hope and Cape Horn, and the creation, first of all, of the Portuguese maritime empires, which brought to an end the effective domination of countries like Egypt, which had handled previously the trade between Europe and India, and also other civilizational factors. But for this period of at least 1,000 years, there was Islam sitting astride the world's great trade routes, those routes that are sometimes known to economic historians as the Golden Web. And this Golden Web spread out from the Middle East. One of the trade routes, in many ways the most lucrative, allowed truly gigantic caravan trains, including perhaps 50 or 60,000 people and as many animals, to arrive on a regular basis from the great cities of China via Central Asia, cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, to the Abbasid capital of Baghdad at that time, that is in the early Abbasid period, had a population perhaps of as many as 2 million. From Baghdad, the same goods would be transshipped on to various other destinations. One particularly important road linked Baghdad to Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, and thence, of course, to Eastern Europe. To the south of Baghdad, there was the also important trade route down to the Yemen being the great source for spices and certain perfumes. There was also to the south of Baghdad the great trading ports of a place called Ubulla, which really no longer exists. And somewhat later, this place was eclipsed by the growing importance of the city of Basra, today the second city of Iraq. But they're very close to each other. Ubulla is a few miles to the west of the present city centre of Basra. Of course, we have from that time the great maritime legends of Sinbad the Sailor, which reflect the enormous cultural importance of this trade and of these two cities. And through Ubulla and Basra, great sea routes linked the Islamic Empire to India, particularly the city of Surat in Gujarat in western India, and further afield to the Indies, that is to Sumatra and Java, where thriving Muslim communities soon grew up, which presided over the peaceful Islamization of that part of the world. Another important city was a place called Qulzum. Again, it has largely vanished into the sands. The traditional Muslim name for the Red Sea was Bahr al-Qulzum. Now they call it Bahr al-Ahmar, the Red Sea. And Qulzum was very close to the present-day city of Suez at the top of the Red Sea. The Muslims were particularly conscious of the importance of that isthmus. There were serious plans for the digging of what was later to be brought into reality as the Suez Canal. And in following the instructions of the second Caliph Omar, a canal was in fact dug, but not to the north of Qulzum, but rather to the west, connecting the city of Fustat, just to the south of present-day Cairo, with the city of Qulzum, right across the desert. And the canal still exists. You can see it, and there's some ancient engineering works and buildings around it. And this, of course, acted as an enormous stimulus to world trade and cemented the importance of the Middle East in that pattern. Finally, and probably of least significance, there was trade with Europe itself. And Europe was really something of a backwater on this great golden web, largely because Europe didn't have very much that the rest of the world wanted. A few raw materials, a little bit of silver from the Balkans, for instance. Cinnabar came from places in Spain, cinnabar being the mineral from which mercury was traditionally extracted, and also raw materials, particularly fabrics, wool from England, for instance, which found its way into the Middle East where it was in demand. You have to recall that by 800 at the latest, the entire Mediterranean basin, not just its southern fringes, was dominated politically and economically by the Muslim presence. In fact, there's a famous Belgian historian called Henri Pirenne, one of the great historical thinkers of the 20th century, who made his reputation 50 or 60 years ago now by publishing a book called Mohammed and Charlemagne. Pirenne's idea was that Europe's self-awareness as an entity didn't exist under the Romans, because Europe was simply part and parcel of a larger Mediterranean ecumenical space. But once the Arab conquests effectively amputated most of the provinces of the Roman Empire from the rest of Europe, then Europe started to turn in on itself and began to acquire a sense of its own identity. And Pirenne's thesis, as it's known, is actually generally accepted now by historians. So this was one of the great formative influences of the Arab eruption on the history of Europe. I've mentioned that it wasn't just the southern Mediterranean and of course the eastern Mediterranean that was dominated by the Arabs, and of course by this time Spain was very firmly in Muslim hands as well. But there were also very significant Muslim settlements, colonies if you like, along the northern coast of the Mediterranean. In particular, we find, for instance, in southern France, in a town nowadays, small town called La Garde-Freinet, more usually known to historians as Fraxinatum. It's not far from present-day Nice. For the best part of 200 years, there was a thriving Muslim city there, independent of the caliphate, but nonetheless very important. It was in fact the most important port of France in that period. It only fell to the Franks in 973. Corsica and Sardinia were also in Muslim hands. In fact, if you look at the the regional symbol of Corsica, now of course part of France, you'll see that it is a black head with a turban. They call it la tête mort, because so much of Corsica's medieval history is intimately tied up with its relationship with the Muslim world. Also on the Italian coast, you had in particular a number of small Muslim settlements, sometimes barely more than garrisons or fortresses along the coast. Amalfi was the best known of these, and one reason for the fluorescence of Amalfi as the first of the great Italian Christian trading states was the fact that patterns of trade and local trading traditions had already been developed under the period of Muslim rule. Sicily, of course, also becomes substantially a Muslim country until the time of the Norman invasion. And as I said, the only break on this almost colonial expansion of the Muslim world towards the north was the fact that the Arabs generally were not terribly interested in Europe. They had this idea, and indeed to a large extent the experience of Europe, as a rather cold, unfriendly place, full of forests with no major settlements, no significant economic activity. The fact that the great intellectual and spiritual life of Europe, by this time becoming quite considerable, was enclosed within monasteries didn't help. And generally the medieval Arab stereotype was of Europe as a kind of dark continent, something quite barbarous and uninteresting. So the Arabs had a lot that Europeans, particularly in the emergent courts, the Ottonians, the Carolingians, wanted to import. They really wanted Arab spices. They wanted finished manufactured goods, particularly things like crystal goblets, gold, silver products, ivory in particular, fabrics and carpets. And in fact, if you look at European paintings, really until the 17th century, usually you'll be able to spot in the background 2 or 3 things that clearly are not of European manufacture but come from the Islamic world. One way in which we have been able to piece together the history of Oriental carpets is by looking at paintings by people like Holbein, who in their attention to detail would pick out in great detail the patterns on these carpets. So luxury goods generally in medieval Europe were almost exclusively imported from Europe. And as I said, Europe exported a few things in exchange, wool and so forth. Also slaves were a very important export from medieval Europe. The slave trade came to be dominated particularly by the Venetians. The Venetians, the great slave traders in that period. Now, one reason why the Arabs found it so easy to dominate the Mediterranean was their superior knowledge of shipbuilding techniques. It's an interesting fact that not only did the early Muslims suddenly acquire the military prowess that enabled them to conquer the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire of Persia simultaneously, which you would think was some kind of military madness, the equivalent, say, of Upper Volta today simultaneously declaring war on the United States and Russia. In those terms, it was quite comparable. But they did that and they succeeded. They divided their forces, defeated both of these great empires. But something we less frequently recall is the fact that very rapidly the early Arab Muslims became a great maritime nation. In the time of the fifth Caliph Muawiyah, the first significant fleet was constructed by the Arabs in Alexandria, and they showed themselves such good sailors that they promptly thrashed the Byzantine navy and established unchallenged Muslim naval superiority throughout the Mediterranean, with the exception only of the Aegean and parts of the Tyrrhenian Sea, which were still regarded as being within the Byzantine sphere of influence. So they had this extraordinary ability to adapt. But in the longer term, what proved no less influential was their knowledge, as I've said, of shipbuilding techniques. And this again was made possible by the fact that the Muslim empire straddled both halves of the formerly divided world. What the Muslims did was to import into the Mediterranean shipbuilding techniques that had long been known amongst the navigators in the far more difficult and treacherous waters of the Indian Ocean. In the Indian Ocean, the distances were much more considerable. Sometimes ships would go as far as China. And the ships were a lot larger and they were a lot sturdier. So we find these ships immediately being introduced into the Mediterranean with the Muslim port cities of Syria and Egypt particularly. The galley, which had formerly been the main method of long-range seafaring in the Mediterranean, was not completely displaced, but by and large the Muslims didn't use galleys very much, largely because they had something called the lateen sail. I'm afraid I can't tell you whether this is actually a word of Oriental origin. It might be. But it was much more effective and efficient than the former rather simple square sails, single-masted square-sailed vessels which had been used in the Mediterranean hitherto, the so-called carrack. Now, European shipbuilders in due season started to pick up on these Arab techniques, and they started to improve on them. And in fact, it is accepted that the great journeys of discovery undertaken by the Europeans in the 15th century, whether around the Cape or across to the Americas, were based in large measure on this Indian Ocean technology that had been brought to the Mediterranean by the Arabs. The use of multi-masted vessels, for instance, hitherto unknown, the use of this lateen sail, and certain technical improvements on how you actually bolt together and caulk a seafaring vessel. So because of this capacity of the Europeans to emulate these innovations, European navigators started to rejoin the world of trade. So Amalfi becomes a Christian city once more. And if you ever visit Italy, south of Naples, Amalfi is certainly one of the most splendid places to visit. It has a wonderful 11th century cathedral, one of whose most interesting features is its, I think, quite happy combination of Moorish and Christian Gothic idioms. The cloisters there in particular are almost completely Moorish in inspiration, with characteristically Sicilian Arab forms of decoration. But it becomes a Christian city again and continues in its former role as a great maritime city. And its example is followed in the 2 centuries that followed by places like Pisa, Genoa, and of course Venice, all beginning their own illustrious maritime histories in this period. Now, these Europeans had trading partners in North Africa, and by this time many of the leading mercantile families in North Africa were not Muslims but were actually North African Jews. And the reason why North African Jewry flourished in this period, at least commercially, was that it was easier for Jewish merchants to visit Europe and trade than it was for Muslims, because there was some kind of tradition of tolerating a Jewish presence in most European cities. There were ghettos where they could live and so forth. People had experience of them, whereas it was much more difficult in practice for a Muslim merchant to visit Europe. So we have at this point the emergence of very important Jewish contributions to Mediterranean trade. Now the pattern so far established starts to be fractured when a dynasty known as the Fatimids, who are a Shia dynasty of Ismaili proclivities, seize control first in Tunisia and then 20 years later in Egypt. One of the things Fatimids want to do is to challenge the Abbasid Caliphate and to flex their muscles in the Mediterranean. And immediately they start to build the largest fleets that the Muslim world has ever seen. And they start to import a lot of wood and iron from Europe. And this is one of the things that promoted the growth of trans-Mediterranean trade at that time. Another thing that made the Fatimids particularly important in Islamic trade was the fact that the Persian Gulf was at that time obstructed by a bunch of extremists, really, called the usual English version of this is the Qarmatians, who were an even more extreme group of Shia who held that Ali was actually an incarnation of the divine. And they wouldn't let anybody go through the Gulf. So these cities of Ubullah and Basra immediately fell into more or less complete redundancy. And Egypt becomes much more important. And from this time, Egypt, really until the 17th and 18th century, remains the great Muslim center for international trade. Another boost to world trade that was at least mediated by Muslim civilization to Europe was the invention sometime in the 12th century of the compass. Obviously of huge importance if you were actually going to be courageous enough to travel across the open sea rather than hugging the coast as most people previously had done. And we don't actually know who invented the compass. Some say the Chinese, who passed it to the Arabs. Some say the Arabs invented it. Some say the Persians. There are even theories to suggest that it was the Italians. But in any case, the most advanced early compasses came from the Islamic world. Another development, almost certainly of Islamic origin, was something called the portolan. Portolan is a kind of map or a chart. Obviously, map making is one of the most mathematically complicated of activities, and the Romans and the early medievals hadn't done it at all well. But with the use of the portolan, whose technical aspects I don't think I'll attempt to outline here, exact navigation with the help, of course, of the compass and other Arab innovations such as the azimuthal quadrant and the astrolabe became something of an exact science. Now, this great domination of the seas by the Islamic world has left permanent memories even in the English language. I've just dished out a list of Arabic words that are of Islamic and of English words that are of Islamic origin. For instance, the most obvious of these is the word admiral. Admiral actually comes from the Arabic Amir al-Bahr, prince or commander of the sea. Sometimes it's thought to be a corruption of Amir al-Rahl. Rahl was a word that was used sometimes for a fleet. Other words such as monsoon or sloop or bark or even cable are also of Eastern origin. And this is a reminder, even in our language today, of this erstwhile domination of the seas by the Muslim world. Now, newly conscious of themselves, as Pirenne indicated, and effectively surrounded by Muslims on all sides, the non-Europeans until this time did have a tendency to think of every other part of the world as inhabited exclusively by Muslims. They had vague ideas, which even they sensed to be legendary, of an Eastern king called Prester John, perhaps in Ethiopia, who one day, if only he could be contacted, could attack the Muslims from behind, and Islam would be definitively defeated. But generally we find, for instance, in the 12th century writer, William of Malmesbury in England, an absolute assumption that outside Europe everybody is a Muslim. However, partly because of these improved techniques of navigation, this started to change, and with it came a major transformation in Europe's view of the world. When the Christians reconquered Sicily in the 11th century, the Norman king of Sicily, Roger II, died in 1154, was curious to know more about the outside world, and he commissioned a Muslim scholar of Cordoba called al-Idrisi, yet another product of the brilliant college that was the great mosque in Cordoba. And he asked Idrisi to draw a map of the whole world. Idrisi, by the way, died in 1166. And Idrisi duly produced not just one, but a series of 70 maps. 70 detailed maps, and many of these have survived, and they are the world's oldest, very detailed maps that attempt to be comprehensive. And these revealed the very, very detailed extent of Muslim knowledge, not just of the Muslim world, but of elsewhere. For instance, there's a map of England. Idrisi himself had travelled in England, and he mentions even small northern towns like Yarmouth and Grimsby, and places that probably most Sicilians wouldn't have heard of. And he places them quite accurately on his map. So these 70 maps, together with an accompanying manual that Idrisi also wrote, became known as the Book of Roger. And this book, or summaries thereof, become the chief source of European Christian knowledge of the wider world. Now, aside from trade, there was another area in which the rise of Islam had a galvanizing effect on European economic life. Hopefully I've sketched to you so far the extraordinary importance of the Islamic triumphs for the emergence of trade in Europe. And the second thing was agricultural technology. And I won't dwell on this in great detail because Munir Sheikh last Friday very ably sketched the impact that this had on the economic life of Spain. He pointed out that before the Muslim conquest, most of Spain had lain fallow, was never cultivated. The Romans and the Visigoths had supported a few irrigation schemes. There are some spectacular Roman aqueducts remaining there, for instance. But Spain's population is believed to have tripled in the 2 centuries following the Muslim conquest. And this was made possible in large measure by the large-scale introduction of sophisticated techniques of irrigation, again from the Near East. The water wheel, for instance, was the obvious example that he gave. And this is reflected in the Spanish language. Again, you'll see some of these words in the list that I dished out. For instance, even today, a common word in the Spanish countryside for a little bridge which takes water across a little valley is alcantarilla, what I encountered recently in Spain. Alcantarilla, which simply comes from the Arabic word alcantara, meaning a bridge. There's even a town in Spain, of course, called Alcantara. Eastern crops also introduced particularly into Spain, also into Muslim Sicily and those other Muslim bits of southern Italy. So we find things like sugar, rice, oranges, lemons, aubergines, artichokes, apricots, cotton and so forth, hitting the shores of Europe for the first time. Also in Muslim Spain, perhaps even more significantly, we find new techniques of mining being developed. Roman mining had been very much a desultory hit-or-miss affair. Drawing on older Near Eastern traditions, the Muslims introduced new techniques of excavating, of propping up shafts, and of ventilation, most importantly, that allowed the natural resources of Spain to be exploited as never before. And in particular, we find Spain becoming a great centre for the export of iron and copper, and again this thing called cinnabar from which they got mercury. And these new Moorish techniques of mine construction and ventilation radiated out throughout Europe and become the basis, for instance, for the mining communities of Lower Saxony, who went on to construct and man some of the great silver mines throughout Europe. The techniques that they were using were originally introduced into Europe by the Moors of Spain. Another thing that is certainly worth mentioning, although it was of no economic use, hasn't really been discussed so far, was music. Again, Spain was the channel for this, and it received its great boost with this famous fashionable person, almost the Beau Brummel of his age, Ziryab, who came from Cordoba. No, he came from Baghdad and died in Cordoba in 857. And through Ziryab and his pupils, very sophisticated instruments for the first time become widespread in Europe. This is his name. I take it it's a Persian name. I don't know what it means. So we find most obviously the lute. The English word lute simply comes from the Arabic word al-ud, which even today is the standard Arabic word for the instrument. We find types of flutes introduced into Europe for the first time. We find a great range of drums. And the minstrels and the troubadours who radiated out from medieval Provence were largely drawing on the very sophisticated folk musical traditions of Spain. It was easy for troubadours and minstrels to cross this iron curtain between Christendom and Islam, to perform one day in a Christian court and then travel and perform in a Muslim court. And they were a great instrument of cultural osmosis again. In fact, in English, one of our most popular rural traditions is the famous Morris dances. I don't know if you've been to England and seen these usually rather soppy but half-drunk figures dressed in white with bells around their arms and legs, sort of jumping about, hitting sticks, and generally looking a little bit absurd.
We have them at high school.
You have them? Okay. Well, you'll be fascinated to learn that Morris dancers are actually Moorish dancers. That's the origin of the word. And the traditions, as you'd expect, have been greatly transformed over the ages and through the process of migration from Spain to England. But scholars accept that that's the origin of this type of dance. Troubadours as well, the word is said to come from an Arabic root meaning delight, usually applied to delight inspired by musical performance. And one of the things these troubadours did was to introduce new poetic forms into Europe through song. Generally, Roman poetry had a fairly simple system of rhythm and didn't bother with rhyme. For the first time in the 13th and 14th century in Europe, we start to find the consistent use of rhyming in poetry. We also find types of strophic poetry, hitherto unknown in Europe, and it's thought, although obviously these things are oral traditions and can't be definitively documented, that they come from Muslim Spain. Also, prosodic forms in popular culture, something called the villancico, which is still quite widespread in Spanish rural society, is an almost exact carrying over into a Romance language of an Arabic poetic form known as the zajal, which was actually developed by the Muslims of Spain. It wasn't something they brought with them. Arabic literature flourished and was most innovative in Muslim Spain. Another key impact of medieval Islam on Europe was the introduction of paper. Paper, of course, was not an Arabic invention. In fact, the early Arabic word for paper, which is karid, is actually a Chinese word. It's not an Arabic word at all. And the legend has it that the Abbasids took some Chinese prisoners because the Chinese were very secretive and always guarded the secrets of these inventions like silk, which for hundreds of years everybody wanted to know how silk was made. It was only in the Middle Ages that the knowledge spread outside China. Similarly with paper, it's said that in the 8th century some Chinese soldiers and sages, mandarins presumably, were taken prisoner, and they were only released on condition that they showed their captors how to make paper. So we find in the year 800, we have an accurate date for this, the first paper mill is established outside China, and it happens in Baghdad. Europe is very slow to catch on. The first paper mill in Europe doesn't appear until the 14th century. Nonetheless, paper was exported from the Islamic world, and we find medieval Latin manuscripts increasingly written on paper rather than things like vellum as they had been previously. So all of these things are cultural areas in which medieval European life was profoundly influenced by what was going on across the Mediterranean. And more generally, one could remark on things like just the general style of refined living, the way in which people used textiles, the way in which they ate, the order that food was served at banquets and so forth. All of these things were imported generally from the East. That's more or less all I wanted to say about Muslim contributions to the economic and general cultural life of Europe. I'd like to spend a few minutes now talking about Muslim contributions to science. To understand this, we have to grasp something of the mentality of the early Muslims. One of the most extraordinary features of them was their flexibility. I've mentioned that not only did they conquer the world, basically, but they were very happy to become a great maritime power, something that was not part of their culture in Mecca and Medina. And another extraordinary feature of their mentality was their very lively intellectual curiosity and the openness of many of them to learning from other cultures. And this was particularly prominent in the case of other cultures which had dimensions which didn't seem to be explicitly religious or to conflict with the Quranic worldview. There are many examples of this, but the most conspicuous and famous one is, of course, the openness that they showed towards aspects of the Greek cultural legacy. Not just philosophy, the most famous case, but also science. So already in the 8th century, we find classical Greek works being translated into Arabic, usually through the medium of Syriac, and very often in the early period it was Syriac Christian translators who were being commissioned by the caliphs to do this. But this activity, which I think should be regarded as one of the great deliberate attempts to be open to another civilization, it's a very almost a unique example of deliberate importation of ideas and attitudes from outside, rather than their gradual percolation. This process really took off with an Abbasid caliph called Al-Ma'mun. Let me expunge this. Ma'mun was one of the great early Abbasid caliphs. You may recall I mentioned his support for the Mu'tazilite theology. And his dates are dates in which he reigned. Ma'mun, very fascinated by theological questions, also increasingly interested in the possibilities for Muslim theology of, is that legible? Of learning from the Greeks. Greek ideas had started to percolate particularly into Mu'tazilite thought, hence his interest. And he decides to do this officially by actually founding an academy primarily for the translation of Greek and to a lesser extent Syriac works into Arabic, so that these could be part of the general patrimony of Arab Islam. And this academy he called Beit al-Hikmah, which means the house of wisdom. And it had a gigantic library, we're told over 100,000 volumes. Remember, this is at a time when the largest library in Europe, which was in Paris, perhaps contained just 400 books. So he had this gigantic library, different languages, and he also employed full-time scholars to teach there and also to carry out these translations. And the best known of these early translators was actually a Syriac Christian by the name of Hunayn ibn Ishaq.
Excuse me, is this in Baghdad?
This is in Baghdad, yes. Center of the world. The Christians tended to lead the field in the Arab East, at least for the first 100 years of this process, because very often they were of Syriac background and hence could translate the Syriac books, and it was easy for them to learn Arabic as well. Syriac being a Semitic language. And also the fact that Hunayn bin Ishaq was a Christian enabled him to travel around the Byzantine Empire, where he assiduously used the caliph's funds to purchase manuscripts of ancient Greek texts. Back in Baghdad, Hunayn bin Ishaq got busy and translated, first of all, the medical works of Hippocrates and Galen. Galen was particularly important in the medieval Islamic world, far more important than he ever became in Europe. In fact, there are 3 times as many Arabic translations of Galen than there are Latin translations. He goes on to show more interest in philosophy, and he translates the key texts of Plato. So the Arabs, for the first time, have access to have access to Plato's Republic, Plato's Laws, and the Timaeus. And he also goes on to translate at least the logical works of Aristotle, the Organon. Now, of this great literature, 2 fields seem to be of most immediate importance to the Muslims as they saw this burgeoning corpus of knowledge in their midst. Medicine and astronomy. Medicine, as a perennially popular practical science, unlike many of the Greek sciences, it actually had a career at the end of it, so plenty of people started to study medicine. And also astronomy. And one of the great reasons why astronomy became such a respected and widely cultivated science in the medieval Islamic world was, of course, because of the astronomical problems involved in the Muslim religion itself. First of all, how you figure out the times of the prayers, and more taxingly, how you determine exactly the orientation of the city of Mecca. If you're in a remote and unfamiliar place, how on earth do you do it? Well, to do it properly, you need to get into things like spherical trigonometry and all kinds of fairly advanced geometrical tasks. So we find astronomy, and particularly its associated mathematical disciplines, very assiduously cultivated by the early Muslims. And in fact, the first Muslim books which make extensive use of the Hellenistic legacy are books on mathematics. Now, the great pioneer of Muslim maths was the great genius Al-Khwarizmi. One of the many drawbacks of computer use is that your handwriting degenerates, but if you can't read these things, let me know. Al-Khwarizmi, Khwarazm, where he came from, is that area of Uzbekistan on the southern coast of the Aral Sea. He came to Baghdad, and he seems to have died around about the middle of the 9th century. We don't have an exact date for it. He was one of the scholars working at this place called Beit al-Hikmah. And the Caliph asked him to produce a revised and more accurate set of astronomical tables. Hitherto, the tables of Ptolemy had continued in use. And also asked him to update Ptolemy's work on geography. And he does this, and does it very well, and in due season these works are widely accepted in Europe as well. But his most important legacy is the very radical advances he made in the field of algebra. In fact, the very word algebra, as is so often the case with words with the letters AL at the beginning, comes after the great work he wrote called Al-Jabr. Which means something rather vaguely like equivalence or compulsion or necessary relations, that kind of thing. And he was able to do this because he was one of the first to use modern style decimal notation, i.e. the use of base 10 and the so-called Arabic numerals. It's a strange thing that although the Arabic numerals were called by the Arabs the Indian numerals, scholars don't have any definitive evidence to suggest that this represents direct influence from India. It remains hypothetical. And this, of course, was a huge advance because the Romans had used the, in many ways, quite clumsy Roman numerals with the X's and V's and so forth, which, as soon as you get into advanced mathematics, become something of a nightmare. And the Byzantines, even more perversely, used base 16 hexadecimal system as the basis for their mathematical system, and of course also used in administration. All of these did not just have abstract applications, but they also had very immediate implications for the way in which your bureaucracy operated, the way in which you kept accounts, the way in which you did business, and so forth. Another important Arab mathematician also associated with this Beit al-Hikmah was a certain Jabir ibn Aflah, known in the West as Geber, Geber. And he really is the great early pioneer of spherical trigonometry, which, as you'll recall, is this important discipline for figuring out the direction of Mecca, but which has other advantages as well. Also influential was somebody called Ibn al-Haytham, known because the Latins had understandable difficulty getting their mouth muscles around the Arabic syllables, known to the West as Al-Hasan. If this was more or less inevitable, because if you wanted to use these words in a Latin sentence, you had to put suffixes and so forth on. So they tended to shorten and Latinize all of these names. Did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm going to go back a couple. For these mathematicians, you said that there were, base 16, different bases. When you go back to Muhammad's time, when they figured out zakat at, I don't know, I guess as soon as it was 2.5, I don't know how that number came about. How did they figure that out? Did they have a base system there?
The classical hadith for it says, in every 40 sheep, 1 sheep. That's the way they did it, as a fraction, rather than as a percentage.
Do you know if they had a base 10 system?
I'm sure they didn't. No, perhaps somebody else here could illuminate this, but as far as I know, it wasn't known in the Prophet's time.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you spell the gentleman's name who did the spherical trigonometry?
Right. He's called... I've been trying to spare you some of the names of the lesser figures. Invariably, as soon as I'm away from my notes, I forget them myself. But he's called Jabir ibn Aflah, and known in the West as Geber. I assume that's how they pronounced it.
As long as we're looking at names, and one thing I read was that name algorithmi is the root of our word algorithm.
Yeah.
As well.
Very much a relevant mathematical maneuver, of course. Algorithms are the basis of computer programming. Now, this Ibn al-Haytham character, he writes more than 50 books. At least more than 50 of them have survived. It's possible that he composed more. And the best known of these, again at the risk of overburdening you with these terms, really a hugely influential work, was known as the Kitab al-Manazir, which you could translate legitimately as the Book of Optics. Optics. The Latins called it Opticae Thesaurus, comprehensive book about optic matters. And he's very original in this book, and he goes more or less completely against the very revered authorities of Ptolemy and Euclid. The most radical thing he says in this book is that light rays do not move from the eye to the object, as everybody had hitherto assumed, but come from the object to the eye. And he demonstrated this in many quite ingenious ways. He was the first to do experiments with things like parabolic mirrors, for instance. He did things with lenses and so on. He also deduced the general laws which govern the refraction of light through a transparent medium, whether it be a gas or through water. So he's the first person ever to have calculated the thickness of the Earth's atmosphere. Of course, you can't actually calculate the thickness of the Earth's atmosphere because it doesn't suddenly stop and beyond you just have the vacuum. But the fact that he thought he could do that and that he used the correct principle, which is measuring the way in which the sun's rays are refracted through it, shows the originality of his thought. Now, obviously, Ibn al-Haytham's discoveries were a very considerable application in the sphere of astronomy. The Arabs, again, making the most of their geographical position, had access to both the Greek and the Indian astronomical traditions. So they translated books not just from Greek, but also from Sanskrit, and also some books from Pahlavi, which was the pre-Islamic language of Iran. And they soon go on to make their own contributions. So we find that the Arabic version of Ptolemy, amended and improved by a number of scholars, becomes known as the Almagest. and this immediately makes the journey over the frontier into Europe and becomes really the basis for astronomy right up to the time of Copernicus. The astronomers were also interested in what they called the Zij, that's Z-I-J, which are astronomical tables. And the best known of these was assembled by a man called al-Battani in about 900. And it's interesting that so accurate and satisfying were these tables that they were used in the Royal Astronomy, the Royal Observatory at Greenwich in England as late as 1749. So they have a career of about 800 years. They're not surpassed in that period. So that's astronomy. I want to talk a little bit more about medicine now. Because, if anything, the Arab contribution to medicine was even more fundamental than it had been to these other disciplines. The Middle East, before the arrival of Islam, was already a major center of medical practice and research through various teaching hospitals. And these tended to be staffed and operated by Nestorian Christians. The best known of them was at a city to the east of Baghdad, called Gondeshapur, which remained a significant center for about 200 years into the Islamic period. And in fact, for the first 200 years of Islam, Nestorian physicians tend to be the best known. And a Nestorian Christian from Gondeshapur called Ibn Bakhtishur, I'll write it up if you want, but it's not centrally important. He moves to Baghdad in about 800, hoping for caliphal patronage. And with cash from the caliph, he opens the capital's first medical academy. This is under the caliph Harun al-Rashid, probably the best known of them all. And this immediately establishes one of the most consistent cultural patterns and phenomena of classical Islam, namely the rich and the wealthy competing with each other, both to buy prestige in the eyes of the world and also to curry favor with God by endowing hospitals and teaching academies. One of the most recurrent and characteristic features of a medieval Muslim city is the bimaristan, or the hospital. I mentioned incidentally already on Monday the use of music therapy in some medieval Muslim hospitals in the treatment of medical disorders. But that was only part of a much wider system which very often provided free treatment. And to understand how this was possible, not possible in some countries even today, of course, was a system known as the awqaf. Is this a familiar word? Waqf, awqaf. Something that should be known. I'll give you the singular of it only. Perhaps slightly easier. Waqf is roughly the equivalent, well, the nearest thing to it in European law is the thing called mutmain, which means a charitable endowment in perpetuity, an inalienable endowment. And what this meant simply was that some wealthy pasha or amir would have 1 million dinars or so spare, and he would sign a document in which this money was made over in perpetuity for the support of a particular establishment. And generally the ruling of Islamic law was that the money itself had to be invested in a physical phenomenon, so that land would become the endowment of a particular mosque or college or hospital or whatever, or shops. So you'll see sometimes in some Muslim cities that a mosque is actually built over a row of shops, and that's because both were constructed by a particular patron, and the shops are simply there to provide income for the maintenance and upkeep of the mosque. So this institution, one of the most characteristic in medieval Islamic societies, it's been estimated that by the close of the Ottoman period, around 40% of land in the city of Istanbul was actually held by these charitable foundations. An enormously important institution, and one that did make possible free education for those who wanted it, and also made possible these great hospitals. It's interesting to remark that the world's oldest continually functioning eye hospital is the waqf of a Mamluk sultan in Cairo called Sultan Qalawun, who was, I think, 13th century. And I've actually visited it, and it's next to his mausoleum and next to his mosque, and it's been functioning, treating eye diseases for the best part of 800 years. But just to give you an idea of the scale of operations which were made possible by this system, there was also in Cairo one, almost certainly the world's biggest hospital, called Al-Mansouri. And this could accommodate, we are told, 8,000 patients. And it had many of the features of a modern hospital. Male and female patients were separated, and there were separate wards for separate disorders. Particular diseases would be confined to different wards, which has obvious advantages. There would be a ward for surgical cases, a ward for mental diseases, and so forth. The hospital had resident surgeons and physicians, also had nurses of both sexes. It had a separate dispensary, administrative section, storerooms, library, a lecture room, and a mosque. So that, unfortunately, one of the inevitable concomitants of medical care seems to be the creation of bureaucracies, and medieval Islam was no exception. So one minor branch of medieval Arabic literature is a genre of books about hospital management. But this was just the institutional framework. Medical theory itself also made great steps forward. And in due course, it utterly revolutionized the teaching and understanding of medicine in Europe as well. A kind of medical canon was created which included some 70 classical authors, mostly Muslims, but also including some Christian and Jewish physicians. And this canon was translated in due course into Latin, either directly or through the medium of Hebrew. The Jews, of course, in the Middle Ages being also known for their work as physicians. There are two people who become particularly well known, two great towering figures. One of them is Razi. I'll venture not to write his name up because it should be easy. R-A-Z-I. R-A-Z-I in this part of the world. He had, again, a Latin name, whether he knew it or not. Razes, which they thought was easier to pronounce than Razi. He wrote a lot of books, including some less-known ones, which indicate, again, some of the timeless features of the medical field. He has a book, for instance, called Why Frightened Patients Forsake Even the Skilled Physicians. And he has another one, which also exists in the manuscript libraries, of which he called Why People Prefer Quacks and Charlatans to Skilled Physicians. Right. A number of sort of reflective books. Yeah, as I say, some things don't change. But most famously, he writes this truly tremendous book called Al-Hawi, which becomes known in Europe as Continens, which more or less means Al-Hawi, that which is inclusive, a comprehensive manual on medicine. Gigantic multi-volume work which includes everything he knew about the medicine, not just of the Arabs, but also of the Indians and the Greeks and so forth. So he proceeds chapter by chapter, and in each chapter he says what the Greeks have said about this disease, what the Indians have said about this disease, what the Persians have said, what the Syrians have said, and so forth. And at the end of these conclusions, he adds his own clinical observations based on his own practice as a doctor, and then gives his own opinion. This book was abbreviated and achieved very wide currency also in Europe under the name of Liber Regius. This was the textbook that they used. Again, becoming subliterate here. They used it in our own hospital in Cambridge at Addenbrooke's well into the 17th century. Razi's only serious rival as a physician was, of course, the possibly even more towering figure of Ibn Sina. Dies in 1037. Again, he has a sobriquet in the West. The great Avicenna, a Sheikh Rais, the great supreme master of this and of course of other disciplines. He was also a significant philosopher, and his main contribution to medicine was another gigantic book called Al-Qanun, known in the West as the Canon of Avicenna. Translated into Latin in the 12th century, completely dominates medical teaching in Europe until at least the late 16th century. There are even cases of it being used in the 18th century in some hospitals in France. So popular is it that in the 16th century alone, 20 different editions of the book are printed in Italy, all in Latin. And there are also endless, innumerable commentaries on this book. Another great physician, this time from Spain, was a man called Al-Zahrawi. Zahrawi's claim to fame lies in his great innovative skills in designing new medical instruments. In fact, if you go to the new Museum of Arab Civilization in Cordoba, they've actually recreated some of his instruments from the very detailed illustrations that he gives in his manual. So the Arabs also become great exponents of the science of surgery. Other sciences, alchemy, of course, the very word alchemy is of obviously Arab origin. Alchemy in the medieval Islamic world, as in Europe, had two dimensions. First of all, the mystical, speculative dimension, the metaphor transmuting base metal into gold, which was seen as being a symbol for the transformation of the soul into something pure and incorruptible. And also the practical aspect of alchemy. One of the things that Arabs did was, and this was largely the achievement of Ibn Sina, was to more or less discredit the notion of the transmutation of elements. They said one element simply cannot become another element. These are fundamental building blocks of existence, and you can't turn one into another. We also find some of these people writing on botany. Perhaps the best known writer amongst the Arabs on botany was a certain Ibn al-Baytar, another Spaniard. He's from Malaga, quite late, I think 13th century. His name is said to be the origin of the word veterinary, because he writes about the treatment of animals. Now, all of these thinkers form part of what I have described as probably the greatest single process of cultural osmosis in history. A twofold process. First of all, the enthusiasm of the Arabs for the old sciences of the Greeks. Then they pick this thing up and they run with it for a while, and then the Europeans take it, and a second process of transmutation begins. Now, of course, from the Eastern or Islamic perspective, that's not the primary function of this process. These things continue to be developed within the Islamic world, and sometimes there's an excessive emphasis in Western texts on this period, on the role of the Arabs as a kind of bridge, as a mediator. The works of Aristotle, Plato and so forth, largely been lost in medieval Europe, and the Arabs came along and they handed them over intact to the Latins. Of course, as I've tried to demonstrate, the Arabs did a good deal more than that. They actually completely revolutionized most of these disciplines, and even after the Europeans had picked them up, they continued to be cultivated in the Muslim world. But what's clear is that it was Muslim thought that kick-started medieval European Christian thought in all of these disciplines. It was Muslim thought that brought Europe out of the Dark Ages and provided the foundations, many of the details, as I'll explain in due course, of Catholic scholastic theology, ultimately opening the way to the Renaissance. Now, I've spoken of this process so far largely from the point of view of the, as it were, exporting nations. And what I'd like to do now is to, as it were, hop over the Mediterranean and see how this thing worked from a European perspective. The importation of Arab science, and to a much lesser extent philosophy, seems to have begun in the 9th century, still during the Dark Ages, in other words, with the translation into Latin of a few minor works that, by almost random processes, came into the hands of the Latins. But this process was really inaugurated in a serious way by somebody called Gerbaut. Quite a brilliant mind. Galbert of Aurillac in France, and he later becomes Pope as Pope Sylvester II, dying in 1003. And Galbert is in a better position than most of his compatriots to know about Arab science, because in his early 20s he had been wandering around Catalonia, almost the sort of medieval equivalent of a present-day hitchhiker. He just wandered around and stayed in monasteries or wherever. And Catalonia at that time was only very recently recaptured from the Muslims. There were still memories of Muslim cultural activities. Many books were still around. And there's even a colourful legend current amongst the medievals that Galbert also travelled to Cordoba, where he took a Muslim teacher in the great mosque. And the legend goes on to say that he seduced the daughter of this teacher and stole his books and ran back to Europe with them. And in that way, scholastic theology and the early medieval Renaissance began. There's no evidence to suggest, however, that he was ever in Cordoba, but certainly he was in Catalonia, where he was exposed to aspects of the Muslim heritage. Galbert, very brilliant, although in the 10th century more or less a lone figure, was the leading astronomer and mathematician of his time in Europe, largely because of what he had learnt from the Muslims. He also introduces the astrolabe into Europe. As far as medicine goes, again another practical science that often traverses cultural barriers more rapidly than do some other things. Early medieval Europe was extremely retarded in medical matters. The only people who tried to make a difference were the Benedictines, who very often would open little clinics attached to their monasteries. Particularly well known was the great Benedictine house at Monte Cassino. The Benedictines also occupied themselves increasingly with translating, particularly this book, which they were very fond of, the Liber Regius, which is the summary of Raz's larger work. But slowly, as people recognize, albeit sometimes reluctantly, the extraordinary merit of the Arab sciences, a tradition of translation starts to grow, and it becomes more culturally acceptable that one rejects the Muslim religion, but nonetheless can consistently say that one is open to more secular aspects of Muslim thought. This kind of duality is very characteristic of the medieval mind. And for obvious reasons, this translation process gains momentum, particularly in Spain. Spain was a great area of overlap, particularly once the Muslim tide starts to recede, leaving little Muslim communities or Islamized Jewish communities or Mozarabic Christian communities speaking Arabic, having access to these texts, marooned, as it were, at the high water mark. And this gathers momentum following the conquest of Toledo in 1085. Immediately we find, as I mentioned last time, Peter the Venerable, who comes up with this Cluniac corpus, which is mainly interested in understanding Islam and constructing a polemic against it, less relevant for the purposes of this lecture. But we find, more interestingly, visiting Toledo, somebody called Dominic Giundisalvi. He is an archdeacon of Segovia, devout Christian, but nonetheless very open to learning from the Saracens. And he teams up with a converted Jew called Ibn Dawood. Giundisalvi himself appears not to have known Arabic particularly well, but the common pattern for these European translations was for them to be done in pairs, with a Christian cleric polishing the Latin, and for the raw translation being done by a native speaker of the language. There are 4 or 5 very well-known instances of such a partnership. So he teams up with this Ibn Dawood and starts to translate some of this rich Arabic legacy. Another important figure in this process, probably the second most important, is a certain Gerard of Cremona, dies in 1187, who translates over 100 books. The mathematical heritage is generally translated into Latin by somebody called Plato of Tivoli, who's operating in Barcelona on the eastern coast of Spain. Translates a lot of these key texts of geometry and astronomy. Another key figure, this time from England, was the monk Adelard of Bath. And we don't know too much about where he picked up his Muslim learning, but it seems that he probably travelled not just in the Christianized bits of Spain, but in Muslim Spain proper. There's another legend that suggests that he went and studied in the great mosque of Cordoba. And he's the one who translates Al-Khwarizmi. Remember this towering figure of mathematics and of geometry. And when he returns to England, he becomes involved in the group that set up the University of Oxford. Another Brit was Michael Scott, who dies in 1236. He, we know, spent time in Toledo, and generally the medievals were very hostile towards him because he seems to have been a kind of almost free-spirited person. And their way of polemicizing against that, his excessive sympathy for the Saracen learning, was to describe him as a sort of occultist, a magician or a wizard. So Dante has a very long graphic explanation of how he'll be punished amongst other wizards and sorcerers in the Inferno. Interesting thing about Michael Scott is that he's also interested in the Muslim remains in Sicily. He travels to the court of the great Frederick II, who was the king of Sicily. Very extravagant, again rather free-willing, open-minded monarch, known as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, because of the extraordinary things he did, eventually excommunicated. And he basically surrounds himself in this court with Saracen traditions. He eats Saracen food, he learns Arabic, he has Arabic physicians and philosophers at his court. He develops an appreciation for Arabic poetry. And he even, particularly shocking to the medieval mind, takes a bath every day, which was one of the reasons officially cited for his excommunication. One of the least comprehensible aspects of medieval history is the way in which, following the decline of the Roman Empire, that great Roman institution, the thermae, or the public baths, immediately shut down. So when Byzantium enters the Christian faith, although obviously it had tremendous advantages, one drawback was that they immediately closed down the public baths. But this tradition is maintained in the Muslim world even today, the famous hammam, the Turkish bath, and so forth. But for medieval monks, this was regarded as something really a bit outrageous. And even today, in Eastern Christian spirituality, you'll still find a few people who regard physical hygiene as in some strange way incompatible with Christian faith. A friend of mine was spending time at a monastery in Greece. He travelled from monastery to monastery, this was back in the 60s, never saw a single bath or a shower. And he became so horrified with this that one day while the monks were at prayer, he filled up the big stone tank where they washed their habits with water and sat down and it had a good tub. And suddenly out of nowhere, a monk appears shouting at him and accuses him of desecrating the monastery, etc., etc., and he has to jump out and run back to his room as nature intended. How such a cultivation of uncleanness can be coupled with the gospel ethic, I don't know, but it's certainly a recurrent feature of medieval Europe. You find sometimes in Muslim discussions of how to deal with these nasty crusaders, the advice that you should keep your distance because they're a bit smelly. How are we doing? Sorry?
His name?
The name, the emperor,
Yes.
Frederick II.
Frederick.
Yeah. So he goes around in a turban and sort of nice silk oriental clothes, and this is just too much for the establishment. Frederick's an interesting example of a particular type of Christian. It's all too easy to assume that all medieval Christians were kind of rabidly hostile to anything that came from the wrong side of the Mediterranean, or to Muslim life or respect for Muslims. But Frederick II, as I've mentioned, while remaining, it seems, a Christian, was actually very sympathetic to his Muslim subjects. Many Sicilians at that time were still Muslim. Another example of this, not to be forgotten, is the great Alphonse X of Spain, known as Alfonso el Sabio, Alphonse the Wise, dies in 1284, rules the still largely Muslim city of Cordoba. And if you go to this museum, which I mentioned earlier, which is called something like the Museum of Medieval Cordoba, I can't remember its exact name. It's a very up-to-date, high-tech museum, and you go into one room, and it's completely dark except for 4 life-sized waxworks. And one of them is Ibn Rushd, the Muslim philosopher and jurist of Cordoba. One of them is Ibn Arabi, the great Muslim mystic, also taught in Cordoba. One of them is Maimonides, another Cordoban, and the fourth is the great Christian king Don Alfonso el Sabio. And one of the unnerving things about this museum is that they actually talk to you. Right? You turn to one of these waxworks and immediately he starts talking to you. And you can choose what language he speaks in. Sadly, they don't have Arabic or Latin in the range of choices, which would be the most obvious ones. And the English translation is this impossibly fruity sort of 19th century public school thing. And to be addressed by Maimonides in those terms is somewhat disorienting. I took she was then three-year-old daughter in to see this, and she was completely staggered by this phenomenon. But Don Alfonso el Sabio is an important reminder that it was indeed possible for medieval Christians, including monarchs, to be open to this Arab heritage. There's a third dimension to this apparently two-way process of transmission, which as yet I haven't really mentioned. And that is, of course, the third party to the great Abrahamic family of religions, the Jews. Now, in Muslim Spain under Umayyad rule, there develops a quite unique symbiosis between Arabs and Jews. And the most obvious initial reason for this was the fact that it was the Jews who had invited the Arabs in the first place. They had been persecuted by the Visigoths. They sent a message to the Umayyad governor in Morocco saying, please come and deliver us because we know that things are much better for Jews in North Africa than they are for us. And in 711, Muslims go in and take Spain very easily with Jewish support. So they're quite close to each other. And we find that the greatest Muslim monarch of Spain, the great Abdurrahman III, had a Jewish physician, Hasdai bin Shaprut. Actually, one of the more significant figures, I'll just give you his patronymic. A great scholar of the Haggadah, the doctrinal exegesis of the Hebrew Bible. Ben Shaprut becomes very close to Abdurrahman III, and he's appointed the chief Umayyad diplomat. So he goes off representing Umayyad Spain to various European courts and also to the east. Ben Shaprut also establishes, with caliphal support, Spain's first Talmudic colleges. And the importance of this is that Hebrew immediately becomes a major academic scholarly language. The great medieval flourishing of Hebrew is basically the achievement of medieval Moorish Spain. So we find Spain becoming the great center for Jewish civilization in the Middle Ages. Maimonides, the most obvious example, died in 1204. Also somebody called Avisebron, that's Ibn Jabirol, who dies in 1058. I'll just give you his Latin name. Rather like Maimonides, Avisebron is interested in the Jewish law and is a rabbi, but like Maimonides also he writes extensively on philosophy, particularly interested in the Aristotelian legacy. So we find that thanks to these people like Ben Shaprut and then Maimonides and Avisebron, an extraordinary fluorescence of Jewish intellectual life. And the significance of this for the purposes of our lecture is that many Arabic works were first translated into Hebrew, and because of the Jewish diaspora in Europe, these works percolated into Europe and were subsequently, either through Jews who remained loyal to their religion or those who became Christians, became part and parcel of the general cultural patrimony of Europe. So this is a second and also quite important channel by which the Arabic learning reaches Christendom. I've talked a little bit about the early medieval period and the impact of Islamic civilization on it. In particular, I mentioned this Gaubert of Aurillac, who's the great, really almost the only star in the 10th century firmament. But it was really not until the 12th century that the Arabic sciences truly start to become appreciated in Europe. In the 12th century, and more especially in the 13th, we find Europeans starting to adopt the Arabic numerals in place of the very unwieldy Roman equivalents. And the key figure here was somebody called Fibonacci. Another agile mind and an interesting customer, Leonardo Fibonacci of Pisa. He, in 1202, publishes a book on mathematics called the Liber Abaci, that's A-B-A-C-I. And he's interesting because his father had been a great merchant and was in fact in charge of the Pisan trading colony in the Algerian port city of Bijaya. And it's thought that Fibonacci Sr.'s dealings with Muslim merchants there made him aware of the superiority of the Arabic over the Roman numerals in accounting, keeping inventory records and so forth. So the elder Fibonacci sends his son to study with the Imam of a mosque in Bijaya, who is also acquainted with mathematics. And Fibonacci Jr. turns out to have a great flair for maths, as very occasionally does happen amongst young people. And he comes up with this book while he's still young, and immediately it revolutionizes mathematical studies in Europe. It's taken up very quickly. The most important innovation in it was the invention of the zero. The zero comes from the Arabic word sifr, S-I-F-R, which means empty, nothingness. It's an Arab invention. Also, as well as the word zero, our word cipher, for more unclear reasons, also comes from this Arabic word sifr. There's more to say on this particular theme, but with your permission, I'll pause there. We can have some coffee, and then afterwards I'll try and conclude this story, and then we can have some questions.